Thank you so much for that. I appreciate it.
Good morning, Pastor Tim.
Good morning. Is that
Good
Edwin?
morning.
Good
Yes,
morning. Good
good
to see
morning.
you.
Morning,
Yeah.
Pastor Tim.
Welcome. You came
Sorry, I
just
did
in
not.
time.
Sorry, I did not attend last Friday, Pastor Tim.
That's okay. Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. Well, let's get started. And we are presently almost in the final steps here, the expositional steps now. We've been talking the last couple of weeks about the sermon itself. And once you've done all of the study, all of the time that we put into the poetic analysis and the word studies and the resources, textual observations, diagram, and all these things, and then finding the author's what, why, how, identifying those timeless truths, and then coming up with the sermon concept and outline. I mean, again, that's a real key step. Once you've got that, you've got the core of your sermon, and then the question is where to go from there. And so some guys just they've done the study, so they just will get up and preach. Others will generate a full manuscript and then go from that. And so I just wanted to spend some time talking about that today, this morning, is what is the value of putting a manuscript together? Should we do that? Is it necessary? And what should we bring
Excuse
into the
Pastor
pulpit
Tim.
with us? Yeah. So in considering this step, we've looked at three aspects of sermon preparation, right? The first was we looked at the structure of the sermon. If you can remember, the structure is basically the introduction, the body, the conclusion. And we spent a lot of time just talking about the body of the sermon. And if you remember, again, the introduction, the goal is to introduce, meaning get the hearer's attention, surface a need as you transition to the text, and then to state the point of the sermon. And then the body of the sermon is the explanation, the illustration, the application of the passage, right? And if you remember the 5 P's, if you can say them with me: point, proof, picture, plan, problem.
Problem.
Right? The point is stating the outline point clearly, and make sure you express that up front. The proof is to explain and then make a case for your interpretation based on the context. The picture is the illustration of it. The plan is the application. And then the problem is identify from that outline point, is there any potential objections? Is there any significant doctrine, anything that might be confusing to your hearers? And then finally, the conclusion is simply, the goal there is to remind your hearers of the main point of the text, direct them to action, and then land the plane. End it smoothly, not abruptly. All right, so that's the structure of the sermon. Then we move to the writing of the manuscript. And here's where I want to talk about the manuscript. What are some advantages to writing out a full manuscript? And by full manuscript, I mean basically writing it out as if you were speaking it. So it's full and complete sentences, complete thoughts. It's the entire manuscript of the sermon. What might be some advantages of doing that? Now, again, we're not talking about what you bring into the pulpit. We're just talking about preparation for the pulpit. We'll discuss the pulpit notes later. Right now, I'm just talking about after you've studied the passage, after you've identified the sermon concept and outline, what might be the advantage to writing out a full manuscript?
Pastor
Pastor
Tim,
German?
it serves as a guide and directions for the preaching of the message of the Word of God.
Okay, guide and direction for the preaching of the text. Okay, good. What are some other advantages to having a full manuscript?
You would also be guided, Pastor Tim, as to how long the sermon would be. Like,
Yeah.
You would know.
it gives the preacher an idea of the length of the message. You know, that's actually helped me often because for me, what I've noticed, if I write out a sermon manuscript that's 6,000 words, that's about an hour sermon for me. Actually, it's a 53-minute sermon, give or take. So if I'm writing out a manuscript and I have 9,000 words, then I know my sermon's going to be 30 minutes longer if I do this whole thing. And that's usually that at that point I know, okay, I'm going to do two parts here. I'm going to do it in two messages, and then I'll expand a little bit on each one. And so it's actually been a helpful guide for me because, you know, it's kind of a bummer when you're preaching and then you realize you've preached half of your sermon and you look up and it's already been an hour. Now, some of you just keep going. You go another hour. But for most of us, that's probably not a good idea because I think our people will be full at that point, right? The basoka ayo, right? They're going to be stuffed. And so, so actually writing out the full manuscript has been a really helpful guide for me to give me an idea about how much time this sermon is going to be. Now, what's interesting, when I first started doing a full manuscript, about 7,500 words or so was for me a 55-minute sermon. But over time, I've done more extemporaneous preaching as I go. So now for me, 6,000 words will be about 55 minutes because I add more things as I have gotten more experience preaching. I've add more extemporaneous comments or thoughts. So anyway, I'm just elaborating a little bit on Kenneth's point there because I think it really is a helpful guide. Are there any other advantages to writing out a full manuscript?
For me, Dr. Tim, it guides me the flow of my preachings, and also give me the eye view of the point that I'm going to deliver to the church, and know how I landed or end up the sermon. Without the full manuscript, maybe it could be messy for me. That's why I write a full manuscript of my sermon.
Yeah, it gives the sermon structure. So yeah, you know the flow of thought. You know how to end the sermon because you've thought it all through. It's not new thoughts as you're preaching, but you've really thought through each point that you want to make and how you would like to begin and end the sermon. So it allows you to really think carefully about things that you want to say and even how you want to say them. That might be another suggestion. It helps to guide the preacher on how to say a certain point. Because if you have a chance to think about, you know, as preachers, we need to be excellent with words. One man said a preacher needs to be a good wordsmith. Now, you know what he means by that? It's kind of like a smith. In English, a smithy was somebody that worked with materials, like a blacksmith worked with iron. And so a smithy was sort of a general term for somebody who worked with some materials to create something. So a preacher needs to be a good wordsmith, meaning he needs to be good with words and clear and engaging. And so if you write out a full manuscript, it lets you think about, how do I want to say this particular point? Or what synonyms, what similar meaning words can I put together here to really emphasize something? Now, some people...
Excuse me, Dr. Tim.
Yeah, go ahead.
The word wordsmith. In Cebu, I see a group who will be part of the Toastmaster. You know, Toastmaster. They're mastering the word itself, how to deliver it,
Yes.
how to speak it. The word. I think that the group is called Toastmaster.
Yeah.
They're really a good in wordsmith. Supposed to be me. I really zealous with looking with them speaking in the pulpit, preaching or saying something. The word, how they deliver it and develop it. Their name was Toastmaster Group.
Yeah, actually, there was there's a group, I think the same group is here. There's a Toastmasters group. I first heard about them about 20 years ago in this area. And yeah, I had a friend who wasn't a Christian, but he went to this group. Wasn't a Christian group, but they would get together and help each other speak, public speaking, be more effective in doing that. So yeah, they need, and that's one part of the class he told me about. He didn't use wordsmith, but he said we're taught how to use words well and to communicate. And that's basically what a wordsmith means. You can take words and put them together and create something that's excellent. And preachers we need to be excellent in not just what we say, but how we say it. So we need to be accurate, but also need to be clear and engaging, right? So we need to be accurate for sure, but also clear and engaging, even maybe interesting. Can you hold people's interest? And sometimes that has to do with just how you put words together. And so that's why I think a preacher needs to be a good wordsmith. Is a great, a very important, helpful point. And doing a full manuscript assists you, aids you in that process. Any other advantages? We're still speaking about advantages to writing out a full manuscript.
It helps you, it guide you to stay on your point or topic.
Yeah, it helps you to stay on point. I think what I've seen in the guys that don't do manuscripts, probably one of the biggest weaknesses I have noticed is they can tend to get on rabbit trails. They can tend to wander off the path because some thought comes in their mind. Maybe they're giving an illustration, and all of a sudden another thought comes in their mind on another illustration, and then another thought connects to that, and another thought, and pretty soon they're way off talking about something totally different from the passage. And that might be interesting, but it for many people, they won't be able to follow you. We had a pastor at our church who was a very interesting guy. He was one of the smartest guys I ever knew. And I loved to listen to him preach because he always had so many stories and so many things he had learned and studied, and he could remember so many things. But a lot of people couldn't follow him in his preaching because he was so smart. He'd come up with a story, and that would remind him of another story, and that would remind him of some other thing that he had studied. And so, I'm just interested in what he's saying, but people could not follow and connect what he's saying to the passage. And so his strength was he was very interesting. His weakness was he wasn't very clear, at least when it came to explaining the text. So yeah, Kent, that's a good point, that it helps you stay on point. I mean, that's why I have notes with me here, so that it helps me stay on point in teaching and talking with you guys. Sometimes I don't do a good job of that. I end up on some other side trail or whatever, but a manuscript helps in that regard. Any other thoughts, advantages?
Dr. Tim, excuse me.
Yes.
Thoughts or concern or comments about if preachers always who keep reading the whole manuscript for the whole sermon. What do you think?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that. That's actually when we get to pulpit notes. Yeah, reading your manuscript's not a good idea. You'll be accurate, you'll be clear, but you won't be very engaging. And that's part of being a good preacher. We need to be engaging and hold people's attention. So we'll talk about that in a minute, actually, some of the disadvantages of a manuscript, and then what do you bring in the pulpit? Because that, again, right now we're just talking about a manuscript. We're not talking about what we take with us into the pulpit. But that's a good point. Any other, just still focus on advantages to writing out a full manuscript?
Also, Pastor Tim, it helps the preacher where he to stress and emphasize every word of the text. Stress and emphasize every word.
Yeah, I'll put emphasis on every word, or especially keywords in the text. Again, it allows you to think about what you want to say and even how you want to say it. All right. Any other advantages to writing out a full manuscript?
Yeah, maybe talking about emphasis, Pastor Tim. Also, writing a full manuscript will help you with a given time divide which part of the sermon you will spend more time on emphasizing, and you would be able to decide also which part can be explained in few minutes only, something like that.
Okay, good. That's a great one. It will help you decide how much time to give to each point. All right. All right. Any others that come to your minds? Advantages. Yeah.
Basically, it ensures that all of the points that you want to convey are there. So
Yeah,
it makes sure writing it all down tells the preacher that all of the points that he wants to convey are there. So if there are anything which is not there, at least he would know. That serves as a general reminder for him.
Okay, good. Good. You know, some practical considerations. A full manuscript will you know, allow you to have a copy, you know, a written copy of the message, well, a copy of the message, which can be given to others. You know, sometimes people have asked me, you know, do I have a sermon manuscript? Because they like the sermon, or they wanted to study a little more. So they ask me, can I have a copy of your sermon notes so I can give them a full manuscript? Now, it won't be everything I said from the pulpit, but it'll capture most of it. And also, too, if you want to preach this passage somewhere else, and let's say it's a passage you haven't preached from for 5 years, and, you know, say a church asks, can you preach, we're having an anniversary service, and we're wondering if you could preach from, you know, the Great Commission. And you think, yeah, sure, no problem. And you go, I've preached that passage before. And then you look and you realize you haven't preached it in 5 years, and you don't have any manuscript or notes. So you have to study it all over again. A full manuscript sort of allows you a starting point, you know. And I use previous manuscripts, but I always make changes. I always go through it, and I've always learned more things, so I add to it, take things away. Consider my audience, but at least it gives me a place to start. So it helps when preaching the same text at a future time. So you can do it with less preparation. All right. I still go through like my study notes and everything when I preach a passage later, but having that full manuscript really helps me save some time. All right. All right. So we can see there's several advantages, but at the same time, there are some disadvantages to writing out a full manuscript. Now, again, we're just talking about writing out the manuscript. We're not talking about what you use to preach from yet. But what are some disadvantages maybe we need to think about or consider to write out a full manuscript? You guys have any thoughts?
You might be locked into the manuscript more.
Yeah, it will be a temptation to bring into the pulpit and then read from it. Okay, so if I have a full manuscript to go, oh well, I've got the whole message here. I'll just bring all my notes in the pulpit and I'll just use my full manuscript. The temptation though is to then just lock into that manuscript and preach from it. So that's one thing. What are some other disadvantages or dangers?
Possibly, possibly you will become possibly.
Yes. Pastor Jess?
Yeah. It would possibly make you a bookish preacher.
Make you what?
Bookish book.
Bookish?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes.
Not natural. You mean
yes.
Yeah, again, if you bring your full manuscript with you in the pulpit, then that could be a problem or an issue because you could sound academic
But
rather than
I also hear
genuine. Yeah.
I also hear some preacher who just simply reads their manuscript, but they were so good at it. David Jeremiah is one.
Yeah.
He kept on reading his manuscript, but he can connect also.
Yeah, some guys are really good. Steve Lawson, I think he probably has 75% of his messages on the manuscript that he brings in the pulpit. And John MacArthur, he writes out most of his sermon as well. So yeah, there are very good preachers who use a large set of notes, so it can be done. But if you're not careful, it is a temptation to rely on those notes more than we should. But again, that's getting us more towards what we bring into the pulpit. I just want to focus on what might be some disadvantages of writing out a full manuscript. I mean, a simple one, right? It takes more time to write out a manuscript.
Yes. Yeah.
So, right, if you write
but also
something
it
out,
helps our.
Go ahead.
Going back to the advantage, Pastor Tim, it also helps our understanding of the text. My point is that in my case, I could only be sure if I learn or I really understand my point, if I would be able to put it in writing.
Yeah, and this is where I think you bring up a great point, Jesse, because this is where we're reminded, a manuscript also, I think, forces us to give our own thoughts. If you have to write it out rather than cutting and pasting from someone else, I think a manuscript will really help you to, how would you say it? Not how someone else would say this, but how would you communicate this? So if you write it all out, it really gives you an opportunity forces you to think about your own thoughts. And then, sometimes when you're writing it out, you realize, I really don't understand this. And so it might help you I need to study this a little more. That's happened to me quite often. I'll write out a certain point and then I look at it and go, I don't really think I understand this very well. I need to go back and study this part of the passage better. And so actually writing the manuscript has helped me at times to see where I'm weak in my understanding. And if I don't understand it well, I'm not going to communicate it clearly or accurately either. Okay?
Mr. Tim?
Yes, sir.
There is a possible when you're totally dependent on your manuscript, then you're going to the church to preach, then you lose your manuscript. Now the question is, what are you doing? That's the disadvantage.
Yeah.
Right. You cry out to the Lord.
You cry out, yeah. Well, that's where, again, we're
Si Lord
talking
ang
about,
bahala.
That's the problem when you totally dependent to your manuscript.
Overly dependent, no?
yeah. I remember I was preaching in Kenya one
Because
time. Oh, go ahead.
I heard a pastor, so he was not, his manuscript was on the laptop. Then it's time for him to preach. Now the laptop hung up. So he did not started yet. He just started the sermon preaching. Why? Because he was really totally dependent to the manuscript of the laptop. Now the laptop did not work. So he just wait and wait until the laptop function well. That's the advantage, disadvantage.
That's why I print out my notes. I don't rely on
Actually,
electronics.
actually, Pastor Tim, one of the advantages of writing a manuscript is that even if you lose your manuscript, you will remember things because you've written it yourself.
Yeah, it does actually. It helps to remember your sermon, and actually, you can preach more extemporaneously, meaning without notes. Extemporaneously. I don't know if I spell this right.
Uh, when we are writing, actually there is an incremental learning taking place. I
Yeah.
don't know if I say it right.
Yes. Yeah. So that's good. One other disadvantage, I think, to writing out a full manuscript is it can give the preacher a sense that he is done with the sermon. You know that okay, I wrote out a full manuscript. Okay, I'm done. You know, I'm just going to wait till Sunday. And the problem is that he can be tempted not to continue to meditate on the text, you know, before Sunday. He can be tempted, you know, not to give more thought to the message. You know, I think what's helped me, you know, when I finish the manuscript is to remind myself I'm not done. This message still needs to be preached. That's almost the most important part, right? Because if you got in the pulpit and said nothing, it doesn't matter what you studied all week. It doesn't matter if your manuscript was the most beautifully written sermon in the history of preaching. It doesn't matter if nobody hears it. So there are still more things that need to be done between completing the manuscript and actually preaching the sermon. All right. But I have found it, as in my experience, that writing out a full manuscript is definitely worthwhile, and I think will help you be a better preacher. Now, again, I'm not talking about what you bring into the pulpit with you. Okay, that's going to be a separate discussion. But what I am talking about is how you prepare yourself for the preaching event. And writing out a full manuscript allows you to sort of think through all that you want to say, all that you would like to say. Of course, in prayer, depending on the Spirit's guidance and direction, but all that you've studied and all that you've thought about, putting a full manuscript together allows you to put each of those thoughts down, write them down. How do they sound? Is it clear? Can you follow my flow of thought? You know, sometimes too, writing out a manuscript will trigger a thought for an illustration or an application. And so it forces you to be more intimate with the sermon. Yeah, somebody has a thought?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Yes.
I think one advantage also is that it will, when sermon time comes, it will just flow naturally because we were able to internalize all the important points during the writing of the manuscript.
Okay, good. It can help the preacher internalize the message. One thing that I will do is after I finish the manuscript, I'll make some, you know, I'll try to get the word count down to about, you know, 6,000 for me, So I'll be editing, and then what I do is actually I just read it out loud, because I write my manuscript as if I were preaching it. And so I read it out loud, and then I can listen, and sometimes things, they don't sound the way they sounded in my mind, you know, when I actually speak them. And so it allows me to actually wordsmith even better to make it more clear in what I want to say. And just that practice allows me to internalize the message as I've written it all out, I've edited it, and then I even read it out loud to myself. And so by that time, I'm pretty familiar with the message. And again, I'm not talking about what's brought into the pulpit, but I'm talking about the preparation to bring us up to that point. Okay?
Okay.
Good comment, Charlie.
Uh,
Yeah, Pastor.
Dr. Tim, one thing I discovered to make internalize my sermon, all I have to do is to, just like I read my sermon aloud, yet I record it the night before. I make a recording of the whole manuscript that I write. Then after that, I will review, I will listen to what I recorded last night. Then, of course, we need to pray until I get to memorize all the poem. That's what I did.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Again, and a full manuscript allows you to do that because you can read it all out loud and, yeah, record yourself and then listen. And then you can take notes. That whole process will let you remember more and more of the sermon so that when you actually go in the pulpit, you don't need as much material to bring with you. So that's a great suggestion. If you have time to be able to record and then listen before you preach, not after, it's I think that I know guys that do that as well. They'll stand in front of a mirror and they'll read their manuscript and record it, and they'll actually video record as well, just to get an idea of that. So that takes some time, but I think it will help you be much more effective in communicating the next, you know, when you preach it. So great suggestion. So, okay, so this is just to get us thinking about, I strongly encourage preachers to write out their full manuscript. Again, for all of these reasons, just it really allows you to think through the whole sermon. And does it flow well? Does it make sense? Is it clear? Am I giving the right amount of time to each point? How long is the entire sermon going to take? It allows you to internalize that message, to remember it better yourself, and even as a way to sort of meditate on. At times I've actually been preaching the message, and I'll hear myself say something, you know, that I've written down, and when I say it, it has an impact on me. It's quite extraordinary, the Word of God, that you can study it. You can even prepare a message from the text, and the words that are in your mind that you write down on the page or type in, and then when you hear it preached, as you preaching it to yourself, how it can have an impact. I don't know if you've experienced this yourselves, men, but I have several times, and just the power of God's Spirit working through His Word, even on my own sermons. So I think there's many advantages to having a full manuscript written out. Now, let me give you some suggestions as to how do we do that? What does that look like then? Okay, I've got my sermon concept, I've got my outline. Now I want to write a full manuscript. I want to write it out, and I understand I need an introduction, I need a body, I need a conclusion. The body of the sermon will have each outline point, but what do I just do? Do I just start writing? Do I start with the introduction? What does this look like? Well, let me just give you a few suggestions. Again, these aren't commands. They're not biblical mandates, but just some suggestions to consider. And then I'd like to hear from you if you have some ideas as well. But before writing out a full manuscript, I have found it helpful to sort of write out what I call a sermon draft. And what I mean by that is sort of a skeletal version. that is not one that's written out in complete sentences that you would read, but sort of like bullet points for each part of the message. I'll show you what I mean by that. So my first question is, what is a sermon draft and how it is helpful? I would say a draft is like a sermon draft is not the full manuscript, but a bullet point version where you are writing down ideas for each part of the sermon. For example, let's say that you were preaching from 1 Corinthians 13, right? Love is patient, love is kind, right? That passage on love. And we want to do an introduction. So let's say, okay, I've done all my study, I understand the context, I've done the diagramming, the word studies, all of that. I have the sermon concept and outline. So I'm ready to write the sermon. Well, the introduction is where I'm going to begin. And so I just put some notes together. Okay, for an introduction, I know I have these goals, right? Gain your hearer's attention, surface a need, transition to the text, and then state the sermon concept. Now I have the sermon concept. Let's say I've come up with this, the superiority of unifying love. Okay, let's say that I came up with that as my main idea for the sermon. Well, let's go back. And I want you to get your input now. I'm just going to call on different guys here and ask your input on here. So we want to gain the attention of our hearers. So let's brainstorm a few ideas. Okay, the topic here is biblical love, unifying love. So what might be some ways to get my hearers' attention if I'm going to preach 1 Corinthians 13? Brother Ruel, I'm going to start with you. He's going, uh-oh. Just throw out an idea. It doesn't have to be profound. I mean, just if you're going to preach on biblical love from 1 Corinthians 13, what's something that might be helpful to gain the hearer's attention?
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh? No. Right? The topic is, love, biblical love.
Maybe Pastor Tim.
Yeah, Kenneth.
Devastating effect of not practicing love in the church, something like that.
Maybe a story of a lack of love in a family or in the church. Or you could talk about the impact of a lack of love in the church. Okay, what else?
Or the biblical understanding of love.
Okay, we're going to get to that when we get to the passage. Right now we're just trying to think of some ways to get attention of our hearers to move that direction towards what biblical love is. How about quote from a well-known love song? I want to know what love is. I want you to show me, right? That got your attention, didn't it?
Too much love will kill you.
Too much love will kill you.
Too much love will kill you. There you go. Too much love. Well, I think that's going to be counter to what we want to accomplish in our sermon. But what about, maybe the history of Valentine's Day? Maybe an interesting story about how did Valentine's Day start? Right? That's a day known as the day to celebrate love. Maybe. So as we gather this morning, have any of you ever thought about where did Valentine's Day come from? I mean, where did all this stuff about a little fat, pudgy angel with wings shooting an arrow? Where did this come from? By the way, Valentine's Day is the third highest revenue holiday of any day of the year, or whatever, something like that. Right? It's not a biblical thing, but it's kind of getting people's attention, interest, and you're talking about love. You know, and then as you transition, you may say, well, Valentine's Day, that's really focusing more on human relationships and human love. What would the Bible have to say about biblical love? What should genuine love look like? How does God describe it? You know, so that's would be how you transition. Any other ideas? Gaining your hearer's attention. Preach this.
Mr. Dr. Tim,
Yes.
I will tell the church that good morning if it's morning. Today we will talk about one of the missing character of God. It is his character of love. And I'd like you to open your Bible in First Corinthians.
Okay.
That's the
Yeah, you
way
could do something really short
that's
like
the way.
that. One of the key attributes of God, right? God is love. If we want to be humorous, maybe share a memory of your first date. You know, my first date with my wife, I took her to a nice restaurant and I wanted to be, you know, like real gentleman. And so I went and got her food. And so I got to the table and I tripped and I spilled the soup all over her dress. So, you know,
Pastor Tim,
she's still married now.
how about cooking your thick?
What's that?
Pastor Tim,
Yeah.
how about sharing your date with your ex?
Oh, that might get you in trouble though if your wife's in the. Sure.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Okay. We won't put that. But maybe, or if you want it not be funny, but share a fond memory from your first date or your anniversary. You know, people really like personal stories too. If you say, you know, the first year, first anniversary we were married, we went back to a place where we spent our honeymoon, and you can just kind of share a little bit. Just it's serious, but it'll get people's attention, and it's personal. It's in the form of a story. So, but see, you see what we're doing here? We just come up with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 possibilities for an introduction. Now they're not fully written out, but they're just ideas to get your mind going. You may not use any of these. You know, I've done that before where I've come up with a few ideas and then I start writing one of them and then all of a sudden something pops in my head.
Yes.
But what this does is it just gets your mind working and it gives you some ideas. You know, and as you're going through, one of these might stick out to you. Like I said, share a memory of your first date. Maybe something comes in your mind. Oh, that's funny. People are really gonna, you know, I'm gonna get their attention with you know, talking about this. Or so, but the idea here is just come up with some ideas. Just you're brainstorming essentially. All right. So let's go to the next thing. Surface the need. So the first part, right, I'm gaining my hearer's attention, so I come up with some ideas there. And then the next part of the introduction is surfacing a need. So what might be some ways to surface a need in the hearers? The need, you know, that we want to encourage them that they should be listening to this message. Why?
Cite biblical injunction, Pastor Tim.
Yeah, love is a biblical command, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So God tells us to love. So we should understand what kind of love does God expect from us or of us? Okay. What else? What me another need we could surface?
The world needs love.
About as Christians, we need to know the definition of biblical love.
So we might frame it in this way. Ask it in the form of a question. Do you know what biblical love looks like? Or do you struggle with loving other people? Maybe we could talk about an example of lack of love in the church. And this could be also a story we share to get attention, but but that also surfaces a need, doesn't it? You could say something like, when you think about relationships at church, do you see some that are strained? Do you see some where there's a lack of love? Does that bother you? Maybe you're in that situation right now where there's somebody here that you're struggling to love. What does God have to say about that? And how do we get to the point that we can truly love the way God desires us to love, right? So you're asking questions that hopefully you're surfacing a need. You could talk about lack of love in the culture as well. Okay, again, so notice here, we've got 5 things. Someone have another?
The importance, Pastor Tim, to exhibit Christ-like love.
To exhibit Christ-like love. And again, you can ask, how does your love, or we could say our love, compare to that of Jesus? You know, how do we follow his example in loving others? All right. I find questions are very helpful in surfacing the need because you get people thinking about it. All right. So we've introduced it. We've got some ideas for introducing this topic to gain their attention. Now we're trying to move towards getting them to think, yeah, you know, I need to think about this topic of love. I need to think about, you know, what it's supposed to look like, or you know, where I need to grow in it. So something like that. So questions I've found to be very helpful. All right, so just come up with a few, brainstorm it, and then transition to the text. And here's just, how do we move now from gaining their attention, surfacing a need, how do we now move to the passage? So something like, so what would be a transition? What is the kind of love that God expects from us? Or let's look to God's word in 1 Corinthians 13 to see what genuine love looks like. Okay? Or what is the kind of love that will promote unity in the body? Let's say that you just shared an example of a disunity in the church and the lack of love shown between two people, just to create the need, and say, so what would you say to those two people? You know, maybe let's say you share a story about how one person hired another person to do some work on their house, and they were cheated out of money, and then they got into a big fight over it and sued each other. And you know, you could describe the story and say, and that situation, that lack of love shown between those two people has really destroyed the church. How can they repair that? What's the kind of love that's going to promote unity? You know, so something like that. Okay? Any other ideas of how to transition to the text? Statements you might make.
Yeah, in our passage today, we will see how, and then so on and so forth.
Okay, we will see. Yeah. You could also, at this point, might be the time to do a brief summary of discuss the context of 1 Corinthians 13. How does it fit in the letter? It's directly tied into the purpose of the letter. You know, 1 Corinthians is really, the focus there is disunity in the body. If you look at all through the letter, that's the major theme. And in chapter 12, people were even using their spiritual gifts selfishly and not for the good and edification of others in the body. And so Paul writes 1 Corinthians 13 to say, I'm going to show you a more excellent way, meaning you guys are messed up. You're not even using the spiritual gifts in the way they're intended. Why is that? Because you don't love the way God wants us to love. And we can talk about, you know, in our church, we see disunity, we see conflict. What is God shown us in order to deal with that conflict? How do we deal with that conflict? But let us learn from Paul a more excellent way. 1 Corinthians 13. Right? So you could even make it general, not even about love necessarily, but about conflict. Because that's the context of 1 Corinthians 13. Paul didn't give 1 Corinthians 13 as a poem to read at weddings. Right? That's not why it's there. It's not really meant to be a love poem or a love message for romantic love. It's actually meant to be given as instruction for how to deal with disunity and conflict in the body. If we would display that biblical love. So you can even present it as, in the context of the letter, it's really a antidote for disunity in the body. So those are some different things. Again, we just have ideas we've put down, and then finally the sermon concept. You don't need to list a bunch of ideas. The sermon concept is just that statement you came up earlier that you would come up with earlier that identifies the main point of the sermon. Okay, so if I step back on this and look at what we have here, this is just for the introduction. Look at all these ideas we have to get us started. Now we will come back and write out, we might reread through these, pray about it, and say, you know what, I really think this would be what I want to use for the introduction. So maybe we'll highlight that and highlight this one. And okay, so you begin to piece together, and then you just write out from those bullet points. Okay? That's the idea that I'm talking about here. So, if we consider this in regards to, let's look at Psalm 99. Now, I just showed you the outline, an example here with 1 Corinthians 13. What I'd like us to do now is we'll read through the Psalm again, Psalm 99, as we have done before, and then we'll just come up with, we'll do the same type of thing for this Psalm, and then we'll focus on just the first outline point to give you an idea of how to develop a sermon draft, all right? And then, so we won't do the whole sermon together, but I'll just give you enough to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we're looking at the rest of the sermon, the body and the conclusion. So let me ask a few of you brothers to read for me. Brother Edwin, can you begin to read verses 1 to 3, and then Joshua verses 4 to 6, and then I'm going to ask Jed, if you're there, to read verses 7 through 9. Okay, so Edwin,
Okay.
Joshua, and Jed.
Verse 1. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and he is exalted above all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
The strength of the king loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
Okay, Jed, are you there?
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Go ahead and read
Okay.
7 through 9, please.
Verses 7 to 9. He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They keep his testimonies and the statute that he gave them. O Lord our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet an avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
Amen. Okay, and what we came up with before, this might seem like a long time ago now, but we did come up with a sermon concept and outline. which was essentially to do homage to the holy. And then we had these, see if I can, we had these three outline points. Extol God for his majestic holiness in the first stanza, exalt God for his moral holiness, and then esteem God for his merciful holiness. So now what we want to do, we're going to develop the sermon draft. So we're going to first do the introduction, just like we did for 1 Corinthians 13. And now the sermon concept, this is the main point we came up with, do homage to the holy. So I'm going to put that in. We already have that one. But now I want to come up with some ideas for these other elements, other parts of the introduction. All right. So the topic here is, to worship and exalt God because he is holy. All right. That's the general theme is, or idea of the message, the poem is holiness. So let's come up with some ideas again on the introduction. How might we gain our hearers' attention for this particular psalm? Any ideas?
Relates a story about worship.
Okay, relate a story about worship. Like, do you have any ones that come to your mind?
Probably David's worship.
Yeah, maybe David's example. In what is it? 1 Chronicles 16, I think it is. He danced before the Lord. They brought the ark there. Okay, good. Any other ideas?
Maybe a story about Thanksgiving.
Okay, go ahead, Charlie, and then Joshua.
Maybe we can talk about the ignorant way of worship that we have here in the Philippines.
Okay, maybe bad examples of worship in the church, in the culture. Yeah, in fact, I don't remember if it was this sermon I did a message I watched preached on Exodus 3, the burning bush, and how the preacher sort of just when he began his message, the electric guitar that was on a stand next to him after the band had finished, they put the guitar, and then there was a way they made the guitar look like it was a burning. And so he looked over at the guitar and he says, "Oh, what is this? What's happening?" And then there's a voice from the speaker, I forget the guy's name, but, Bob. And the preacher goes, "What? Is that you, Lord?" "Yes, Bob, it's me," and it kind of just made a whole mockery of the holiness of God. Because if you remember, right, when Moses approached the burning bush, what was the first thing that God said?
Take
your sandal.
Take your shoes off. Yeah. Remove your sandals, buddy. You're on holy ground. This is no ordinary place. It was very serious. But this preacher was like going on about, joking about it. And then at the end, he leans over to the guitar and he goes, like he's blowing out the flame. I mean, just total irreverence. It was very, I was pretty angry when I saw it. But yeah, that'd be a bad example of not showing God the worship and respect he deserves because he's holy. Joshua, you had one?
Maybe a story of paying homage to a king and relating it to the holiness of God.
Good. Paying homage to a king. And the relating it to God. Yeah, that'd be a good one. And you could draw on either a modern example or an ancient example. In the ancient Near East, if you were to enter the throne room of a king, you were not allowed to have your head above his, and if you did, you could something like that, or like the Japanese emperor, you weren't even allowed to look at him. If you did, that would be a serious violation. So yeah, that'd be a good story to kind of convey the seriousness when you approach a person of great rank or position. Any others?
I remember a story of a farmer, Pastor Tim, who brought a big carrot to the king. And then when the other servants saw it, he brought a big horse. And then the king told the the king told the farmer that you own the land now because of what you did. But he told the one who brought a big horse, you get the horse because you did not bring it to the king, you give it to yourself. Something like that. So
Yeah, that's a great
yeah.
one. Yeah, that's really good. So farmer, and then you just need enough notes here to remind you of the story. You know, you can write it out in full when you do the manuscript if you decide to use this for your introduction. But right now we're just kind of bullet points to summarize maybe some key ideas. Maybe describe the scene of Isaiah 6 or Exodus 19 or 20 or Exodus 3. You know, just open with the story, but from Scripture. So imagine yourself standing with the people of Israel. You just come out of the land of Egypt. You just experienced the great deliverance from the Red Sea, and you just seen God destroy Pharaoh's army and all the chariots, and now you've journeyed to Mount Sinai. And then you can just start describing the scene there. And you've heard rumor that God was going to speak and that Moses had been talking with God and he was now going to speak to the people, and you're excited. But then at the same time, you know, you can describe the scene as you're standing around the mountain's shaking. Smoke comes from the mountain, and you hear from Moses, "Do not touch this mountain or you will die." And you realize in that moment, you are standing before the most powerful being in all the universe, God himself. You know, something like that, right? Where you could just describe the scene from a biblical account. Isaiah 6 would be another. Or Revelation, what is it, Revelation 4 or 5? I forget. That describes the
4.
scene in heaven where the creatures cry out, "Holy, holy, holy."
Chapter 4.
Is it 4?
Or
Chapter 4.
You could describe that scene. Just say, imagine yourself, you're the Apostle John, and you've been allowed to see and enter into the throne room of God. And as you're standing there, you know, and you just describe the scene. That can be, if you tell stories well, if you're very vivid, that can capture people's attention. Okay, how about surfacing a need? What might be some ideas to surface a need when it comes to the holiness of God and the idea of our need to exalt and worship?
I think you can talk about the cost of worshiping God the wrong way.
Yeah, you could even, you know, what does God think of how we worship? Yeah, go ahead.
I think in the Old Testament it would cost you your life if you approach God in the wrong way.
Yeah, and you want to surface that need in your hearers, so you need to ask, you know, how much do you really think about how you approach God? How serious do you take it? Now, especially if you've described like the scene in Isaiah 6 or something like that, and think about, is this the attitude in which you have when you approach God? And what do you think about those who don't? And like I said, you could even use maybe in the introduction, do the story of Uzzah. Who remembers who Uzzah is?
Yes.
the
The
one
one
who
who
holds
touches
the ark.
the ark.
Yeah, maybe you can start with that one. And, you know, that can lead to, you know, the seriousness of worshiping a holy God in the right way. You know, we haven't seen anyone drop dead in a worship service because of not worshiping God in the right way, but that doesn't mean that God is happy with all that he sees in our worship. And, you know, like I said, I use the example of that preacher and the burning guitar just as it's just a really horrible way to treat the holiness of God. Any others? Surfacing a need.
Dr. Tim,
Yeah.
I'm going to ask the hearers the question like this. Don't you know that God has a blueprint of right worship in Exodus 19, which speak about his character and how the people approach the holy throne of his holy throne. I start with a questioning if they really know that God has put a blueprint of right worship based on his character.
Yeah, that's good. You could even ask, does God care about how we worship him today? Or about how, does he care about how we approach him?
Pastor Tim, I have a question.
Yes.
How should we limit surfacing a need? For example, the ones suggested there are, you see, we get it from another passage. What if we're not discussing that particular passage? Would it not give us a tendency to somewhat dwell more time? For example, when Pastor Sandy mentioned about the blueprint in was it Exodus? The danger of like spending more time instead of just surfacing a need with the hearers.
Yeah, you have to be careful with that. I think on this particular psalm, and you'll see it when I give you the full manuscript, I actually spent a little bit of time. This was one of my longer introductions because I saw a great need for people to understand the importance of the holiness of God today. And so I actually, I spent a little bit of time trying to develop that so people see that this is a need, because I think many people in churches have gotten so casual about how to approach God that I really wanted to make sure people saw this is a problem, and it could be a problem for us. You know, how do we sing to God? How do we humble ourselves, or do we humble ourselves before his word? You know, and then so yeah, you got to be careful if you bring up another passage that you don't preach a sermon on that passage in your introduction. I think, is that what you're concerned about? You spend so much.
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Yeah. So you have to make sure you understand, okay, the intent, like if I'm going to do describe the scene of Isaiah 6, I have to remind myself I'm not teaching Isaiah 6, but I just want to tell the picture of what happened there in Isaiah 6, because I want to just emphasize you know, the awesomeness of God's holiness in Isaiah and how that impacted him. So I'm basically want to make sure I'm telling myself I'm not preaching through that text. I'm just telling the story from that passage as a way to gain people's attention. And they'll be familiar with it. You know, most people have heard something of Isaiah 6. So, yeah, there is a danger there. So you have to be careful. And I've seen that happen, you know, where a guy gets on a passage in the introduction and he ends up doing a 20-minute mini sermon before he really gets to the text. So,
Excuse me, Pastor Tim.
yes, Sandy.
Yeah, but if you really know the passage, the next is the translations to the text. You know how to bring them to the text.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, if you remind yourself of the intent of why you're bringing what you're doing, you know, if you're going to give the story of Exodus 3 and the burning bush, you know, that you just want to focus on telling the story to engage the hearers and to move them towards the topic of the importance of God's holiness and how we should rightly exalt and worship him for his holiness. So, you know, another surface the need, sometimes you can quote from a book that talks about the concerns or issues. For example, I read a book by David Wells called what was the book called? I can't remember now. I'll have to I can't remember, but it's in my exegetical notes, because remember I told you guys before, it's helpful to be reading books on the topic. Like I mentioned R.C. Sproul's book on holiness, because as you're reading, he might say certain things or have illustrations that might be good to use in your introduction. And so David Wells in his book, he said something like, the church has an infatuation with the love of God, but is embarrassed by his holiness. Something like that. And I just remember that stuck out to me, like how he said that yeah, we always want to talk about the love of God, but people seem sort of embarrassed when we talk about his holiness and shy away from that. And anyway, the way he expressed it I thought was helpful. So I included some of his, I remember the book. I think it's called God in the Wasteland, if I remember right. Anyway, you could use a quote from another preacher or a person from the culture that expresses the need or the concern that you have. Okay, so that's another idea. Okay, how about transitioning then to the text? Any ideas about that? I think what Pastor Sandy mentioned earlier, something along the lines of, does God care about how we worship him today? That could also serve as where you said, do you know God as a blueprint? So you could say something like, in Psalm 99, we see God's blueprint for how to approach him in his holiness, something like that. Or what does it mean that God is holy, and how should we as Christians today respond? Okay. Any other ideas?
I think we can also say, let's look at Psalm 29, Psalm 99, and learn how should we worship him.
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. Can you say that again?
Let's look at Psalm 99 and learn how should we worship him.
It's something which shows us how we should rightly worship him. Something like that. Yeah. Okay. Good. Again, if we look at what we're doing here, let me just back out a little bit. So notice we have a lot of different ideas for the introduction. And again, you only need to probably choose, one thing from each section here, and then just what you can do, and then it's just when you write the manuscript, just fill it out. Okay? Any questions so far? Any comments before we move on? Okay, well, let's now go to the body of the sermon. Okay, we've had practice with the introduction. Let's look at the body. And again, the first point, the point is this: extol God for his majestic holiness. And so now what we want to do is come up with our P's. We want to come up with some ideas. Let me back out a minute. For point, proof, picture, plan, and problem from this first point. Okay? And we're going to take the same approach. We're just going to look at each of these, the proof, and the picture, the plan, and the problem, and just come up with a few ideas for each part. So as we consider the proof, okay, we're going to want to make sure that we, you know, as we look at the passage together, maybe we would describe the image of God's greatness as expressed in verse 1. You remember when we went through the imagery of the poem and we noticed verse 1 had this image of God high above all the creation and being, you know, focusing on his greatness. So you might want to explain that. You may want to identify, as you're explaining this first point, identify what enthroned above the cherubim, what that meant, right? And we talked about, oh, by the way, I didn't show you this before. Let me see if I can find, let me show you a picture. You guys want to see a picture? Some of you do. All right. I found this picture of sort of a representation of the Holy of Holies. Okay. And let me see if I can. This is just, you know, one guy's interpretation of it, but I think it was, okay, can you guys see the picture here? It's, let me move this over.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And, right, notice here, this is the Day of Atonement, right? So we see the high priest down here walking in with the incense, the right incense, by the way, and he's approaching the ark. And the Ark of the Covenant, there's the cherubim around the mercy seat. You can't really see the mercy seat here over the ark. But remember, here's the two poles that the priest would carry the ark by. And then within, I was just reading this in my quiet time the other day in Chronicles, how it described within the Holy of Holies were these two massive statues of the cherubim. They were like 15 feet wingspans, you know, 5 meters wingspan. So it's like 30 meters across or 20 meters across here. And so here, and it was about this high, it's about 15 feet high, something like that. So the high priest comes in and there's these massive statues of the cherubim. And again, we're reminded who are circling. Remember Isaiah 6 and Revelation 4? Who is circling the throne of God, crying out, holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts,
Cherubim.
the cherubim. So imagine the priest, he's walking into this room and there's this representation of these creatures, these huge statues, and these are creatures that are flying around the throne of God, crying out, holy, holy, holy. And so this picture in Psalm 99, it says, God is enthroned above the cherubim. So I think it's a picture of this Holy of Holies, that God is above the cherubim. Because again, remember, Psalm 99 talks about the footstool, which was a reference either to the temple or the ark, the holy hill, which is a reference to the Temple Mount, Zion, which is a reference to the temple. So I think it's just another way to express the image of God, the Shekinah glory of God hovering above the cherubim in his holy place. So again, we don't know exactly what it looked like in here, but this is just a picture from the description given in Chronicles of the Holy of Holies. All right, so that might give you a picture in your mind when you think of that verse that says he's enthroned above the cherubim and what that might mean. Okay, so let's go back to Okay. So in my proof, that's where I'm explaining. Again, remember, proof is the explanation of the point, the argumentation of the point, that you're making a case for your interpretation of the point. So you're going to have other ideas. Might be define the terms, the words great and exalted here.
Significant words.
Significant words, right, from our word study. So that maybe that will come in here. Maybe you can describe the there's a chiasm in verse 2. Now you wouldn't talk about chiasm, but you might describe where he says the Lord is great in Zion, and then exalted he is above all the people. So you could, there's, you're talking about the emphasis as you define these words great and exalted, noting that there's a chiasm. You could describe there's great emphasis here on these words. You might include in this that God's a definition of holiness from Scripture. Maybe some examples of God's holiness from these passages. You know, that he's not just a holy God in the Old Testament, not just holy in the Old Testament, but also the New. I mean, so again, these are just things that come to your mind that you would want to include in your explanation and argumentation for how you've interpreted this first point. Okay? And then you might move to, and I'm just doing a few. You might have a long list here of things that you want to include in that explanation. I'm just giving you an example. And then as you think about illustration, you might think about, okay, what might be some ways to illustrate the greatness and power of God? Maybe the power of the sun. Do you guys realize, by the way, 1 second of the energy, or let me say it this way. The energy the sun releases in 1 second is equal to the energy of 2 billion nuclear power plants in 1 year. So sun releases the amount of energy in 1 second, right? It's more than 2 billion nuclear power plants produce in a whole year. And think about how many billions of stars in the universe. So this is kind of an illustration of the greatness of God, like his power. Like he created all things with a word. Or maybe think of an illustration of how the modern church brings God down, makes him less exalted. Right? Books like The Shack. You guys familiar with that book? The Shack?
Movie.
Yeah,
that's a movie
the woman
too.
God.
Yeah.
The woman God.
See, that might be an illustration. You know, our culture today, even in the church, one of the most popular books in the church, at least in my country in America, is this book called The Shack, which represents God as a woman. And you know, you could talk about a few of the really bad heretical ideas presented about God in that book. Or you may have an illustration from, you know, examples of God's power in Scripture. And again, we might go to Isaiah 6 or Exodus 20 or Revelation 4 if we didn't use those in the introduction. Maybe a personal story. I remember when I visited a waterfall in Yellowstone Park here in actually right here in the state of Idaho. And I remember standing right at the waterfall near the base, and feeling the power and the force just of this water coming over the cliff and hitting below, and just the thunder and how my heart shook with inside my ribs. It was so powerful. So maybe a personal story of experiencing some great power and then connecting that to the greatness of God. Do you see the idea here? I'm just coming up with some ideas. I'm not writing out a manuscript. I'm just, any thoughts that come to my mind, I put them down, and I'll just go with maybe one of these examples in my sermon. But again, it's brainstorming, just getting me to put things down so that later when I actually write out the full manuscript, I have lots of ideas that I've come up with planned. So some ways to application. Maybe I'll ask some questions. Do we treat God as great? Do we extol him in prayer, in singing, in response to his word, in church? Okay, maybe I'll ask a series of questions by way of application. Or what do you do to remind yourself of God's greatness? Or maybe you say, encourage them to memorize Psalm 99 verses 1 to 3 or some other passage that focuses on God's greatness. Or stuff like that. Ways to cultivate a right view of his holiness and greatness. Okay? Again, just putting ideas down. All right? And then finally, a problem. How can God be both high above and among us? If you guys are familiar with these terms, transcendent and immanent. Transcendent means high above. God is far above us, but immanent means that he dwells among us.
Ever present.
Yeah, how does that work? How can God be so great and far above his creation and yet at the same time be among his creation? That might be a problem, a theological problem to consider in this passage. Or how about, are believers to experience terror at God's majestic holiness? Now that might be a question that are in some people's minds. Okay, so again, you see what I'm doing here? I'm just laying out some ideas for my five P's. And then I'm going to take these ideas and again prayerfully think about them. And once I've done this for the whole sermon, and then usually I'll just set it aside for a little bit, do something else, then I'll come back to it, and then I'll start writing out my manuscript, and now I've got a list. I've got a list of ideas for my introduction. I got a list of ideas for my sermon points, and I didn't do the other 2 points, but basically, and then you just sit down and write it out. Okay? Now again, some people, your minds may not work this way. This won't help you very much, but others, maybe it will. If you give some time to think about some ideas beforehand, that'll make it easier to write out your full manuscript. Okay? So, any comments or questions? And then a conclusion, right? We want to, let me just give you a few ideas here, and then we'll finish up for this morning. All right?
Pastor,
But in our
Pastor Tim, I have a clarification regarding the problem.
Yes, sir.
So, for example, the one that you wrote there, how can God be both? So how will we, answer that or something like that? Sort of, how will we give answer to that? Will that point us to the next point? Is that it?
Well, maybe in the course of as you're talking about, maybe you just, we focused on these words, great and exalted. And you're going to be talking about the fact that God is so far above us. That's his majestic holiness emphasizes the fact that he is completely unique, far above us. And you may think, what? I think some people in the congregation may then be asking, well, then is it okay for me to approach him? You just described the scene of the throne room of God. I mean, should I even be here? If God's so transcendent, then does that mean that I'm not allowed in his presence? Those kind of things. So then you think about, maybe Ephesians chapter 3, which describes how, or chapter 2, which talks about we can enter God's throne room through Jesus Christ. Or in chapter 3, it talks about entering boldly into the throne of grace, that even though God is far, far above, yet he makes himself accessible to even us.
Also, right after giving the problem questions, you give also the answer, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because what I'm doing is, in a sermon, you're trying to engage, right? And you want the people to be active listeners. And so what I'll often do is in the sermon, now some of you may be thinking at this point, and maybe you just gave the illustration about God's power or his greatness, right? And you say, now some of you may be thinking at this point, if God is so holy, if he is so great and far above, then should I even be allowed in his presence? Maybe some of you are thinking, how is it that if God is so transcendent, does he truly dwell among us? Just anticipating potential questions that your hearers might have, and then answering it at that point. And then I might even say, how would you answer that question? And then just maybe give a verse, or
potential questions or counter arguments to what you just said. Something. Are you referring to that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or here, because I brought up in my introduction maybe how people are treating God as casually. Like they focus on the fact that he's among us, but they forget about the fact that he's above us. And so I might connect back to that comment in my introduction. You remember that what I told you about what David Wells said? Or theologian Bruce Ware said that we focus so much on his transcendence that we forget about, or his immanence, that we forget about his transcendence. And what he meant by that is we give so much attention to, oh, Jesus loves you and he's your brother, and let's put our arms around Jesus. He's my homeboy. He's my buddy. There's so much focus in the church on that today. In these songs sing like Jesus is my boyfriend, and that it really has brought God down to our level. And so Bruce Ware said there's such a focus on the immanence, the nearness of God, that we forget about his aboveness, his farness. And so I might bring that up in this first point as a problem. The immanence and transcendence of God. How do those work together? How can God be far above creation and yet at the same time among creation and still be holy?
Is that a rule, or you just find it like more effective to be also more engaging whenever you would present it in a question manner, and then before giving right away the answer?
Yeah, I think questions are one of the better ways to get people to think actively. Right? When I ask you guys a question, I think some of you are might thinking, "Uh-oh, I hope he doesn't call on me," or you're thinking, "Yeah, what is the answer to that question?"
Yeah, or it brings us back on track when we lose our focus.
Yeah, exactly. And so I found questions to be a very effective way to sort of engage with people, even though they're not, going to talk at that moment. It's only one-way communication. You're preaching to them, but questions sort of hopefully are prompting their minds to think a little bit about that. So even in the plan, right, as you look on the notes here, asking these questions, do we treat God as great? Do you extol him in prayer, singing in response to his word? Ask a series of questions for application. Can be very effective. Okay. All right. Now let's look at the conclusion here just quickly. Let me give you some quick thoughts about that. Again, in conclusion, you want to help hearers remember the main point. So I might summarize the main point by quoting, Exodus 15:11, where Moses says, "Who is like you, God, majestic in holiness?" And so that's a good summary quote. Or, restate the sermon concept and outline. Then any ideas to direct, the hearers to action, maybe ask some questions again. Does he not deserve our worship and our service? And, I might have a few questions like that. And then land the plane, maybe we sing or recite the hymn, Holy, Holy, Holy. Right, holy, 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 that one, Lord God Almighty. So that might be something you do together, or give them a time of silent prayer to ask themselves how they do homage to the holy. Okay? Something like that. I'll give you these notes that has all this detail in the handout for you. So the point is, I just want you to see that what we're doing here is essentially laying out the whole sermon in bullet point form with just ideas. We brainstorm ideas for the intro, the body, and the conclusion. All right? So this exercise might take you an hour or so, but I think if you're able to do this, that's going to allow you then to come back and write out your full manuscript very, very much more easily. All right, because you've already come up with several ideas. And then sometimes what I found is these ideas, I might have come up with this idea here, illustration like this in the first point, and I might think, you know what, actually that would be a good introduction. I'm going to use that for my introduction. So sometimes the brainstorming process will help you to come up with ideas of different, or you might have an idea in your introduction, and I actually did this, where I thought about this for an introduction point, but then I didn't use it in my introduction, but I used it later as an illustration in one of my points down in the body of the sermon. Okay? So sometimes these ideas can actually help you to in other parts of the sermon, just doing this process. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments?
So, team,
Yes, Jed.
are these 5 P's applicable to the narrative, epistles, and yeah?
Good question. The 5 P's, are they applicable to the other genres? Well, definitely epistles, okay, because those are didactic, they're instructional. So the epistles are laid out. You're going to have an outline, the point, proof, picture, plan, probably the same thing. Narratives. Narratives are a little different, right? Because they're in narratives, if you remember, we studied them, they're stories. And so it's often better to preach a narrative as a story. And so in a narrative, we're not going to necessarily have 3 outline points. We're going to be going through the narrative scene by scene. So instead of an outline point, we'll have a scene, and we'll describe the scene. And normally, the point of the story doesn't come until the end. So actually in a narrative, the typical format will be, there will be an introduction because you want to get people's attention, but maybe, let's say you're telling, you're the story of Jonah, you might start an introduction with, how many of you like to fish? What's the biggest fish you ever caught? Now, did you ever catch a fish that actually swallowed you? Or something like that. Well, today we're going to go back to a well-known story in the Bible about where a man got swallowed by a fish and he survived, or something like that. Okay, that can introduce you to the story. And then you tell the story of Jonah, and go scene by scene instead of, you won't have outline points. And then the point of the story of Jonah comes at the end where the focus is the compassion of God. And that's where you will then bring in the application and maybe problem. So your P's will come out, but it won't be with each outline point. It actually might end up happening more toward the end, your plan and your problem. You probably won't have many illustrations because you're telling the story, that the story is the illustration. So genres are a little bit different in how you would preach them. Now, some people preach narratives are a little different. Some people preach narratives like they preach epistles. You can do that, but I don't think that's the intent. Otherwise, I think God would have had it written as an epistle if he wanted it preached like one. I think if God had it written as a story, we should do our best to try to communicate that story as a story and lead people to the point of the story. And once we communicate the point of the story, then we can bring in application and questions and things like that.
So Pastor Tim, it's not ideal to preach narrative in didactic.
No, I don't think it is.
Especially-
It's not wrong to. I'm not saying that, but I think the most effective way to preach any text from Scripture is to preach it in the way that it was given.
Okay.
So in poetry, we're going to focus on some of the figurative language and the imagery and things like that, and the emotion. In epistles, we're going to focus on the structure and the flow, and that it progresses. It's deductive. We'll state the point at the beginning and then show from the text how we get that point. But in a narrative, you tell a story, and the point of the story, you can't know the point of the story till you get to the end of the story. Okay? And so each scene builds upon getting an understanding of the story, and then by the end of the story, when you see the whole plot, that's when we go, oh, so this story is about God's compassion for the lost. So certainly there are principles within stories that we can draw upon, but we have to be careful that we don't make the story just a bunch of theological truths that we expound on like an epistle. There may be theological truths within the story, but we first need to teach the theological truth of the story. Did you guys catch that? There may be theological truths found within the story, but those may not be the intended focus that the Holy Spirit wanted. We need to preach the theological truth of the story as our focus. For example, I think I mentioned this to you guys, I don't remember. In John chapter 4, when Jesus, it says at the beginning that he was tired, and he asked the woman at the well for a drink. Okay? Now, I've heard some guys basically make a whole sermon out of that on the humanity of Christ. But notice here, brothers and sisters, Jesus was tired. He was exhausted. Why? Because Jesus, the Son of God, was also a man. And they'll then do basically a topical sermon on the humanity of Christ. Now, is it true Jesus became a man?
Yes.
Yes. Is it true in that text when it says he was tired that was an example or illustration of the fact he is a man?
Yes.
It is, right?
Yes.
But here's the thing. Did John intend for that to be a focus of what he wanted us to see from the story?
No.
Oh,
No. Now it's perfectly fine to make comment about that. Notice here, before we continue in the story, did you notice here how Jesus was tired? that again, we're reminded of his humanity, that he was a man as well as God. So it's fine to make a comment there, but move on to the point of the story. The focus of the story is not the humanity of Christ. It is that Jesus, and in one sense it is, in fact, that he's the Messiah, but the focus of the story is that Jesus was sent to the lost, and we are called to the lost as well, no matter what race or culture they're from. And so I've seen guys sort of take, as they go along in a story, they find these theological truths and they preach those truths, but they don't really preach the truth of the story. And that's what the Holy Spirit intends first. So again, it doesn't mean you cannot make comment on truths that you see, doctrines that you see within the story. That's perfectly fine. Just, I would not make that the whole sermon. Because the story was given to us as a story, and there's a point to the story that the author wants us to see, and we see that as we look at the story as a whole, not as we dissect pieces out of the story and focus on those like we would an epistle. So I think an effective way to preach narrative is inductive. That is, tell the story and then let the point come out as you reach the end of the story. Now, if there are doctrinal truths within the story that you want to give attention to, I would do those as a follow-up sermon. Teach the story first and its point in the context. And then next week, if you want to focus on the humanity of Christ, go for it. Say, now last week we saw from John chapter 4 and the woman at the well, if you remember, that we saw from that story how John focused on the fact that Jesus is the Messiah who came to the lost, and that we are called to the lost as well. Now there was something that John said in that story that I wanted to focus on this week, because I think it's an important doctrine that is often neglected in the church, and that is the humanity of Christ. So it's perfectly fine to focus on any doctrinal truth you see, but I would not try to give a full account for it while I'm telling the story. I want to tell the story first and get to the point of it, because that's the main thrust in the narrative. Long answer to a short question, but thank you, Kent. That's an important one to consider. All right. Well, I want to give attention a few minutes here to the next steps here for us in moving toward module 4, excuse me, right? Yeah, you're on module 3. The intent of this workshop was really to try to just go through an example together of a poem, go through each step, be able to give more detail, more explanation, maybe hopefully help you see better kind of how to go through the process. But what we want to do is continue moving forward toward the next module. And to do that, it's going to mean a couple of things. One is we need to finish all of our assignments for module 3. Okay? So some of you have done all of them. Some of you have done part of them. Some of you have not done very many of them at all. So what I wanted to do was this. Once we finish this workshop, is what I'm thinking is I'll continue to have this Zoom meeting each week. And what I'll do is focus on, we'll spend 4 or 5 weeks working on all the assignments for your Old Testament, for your Psalm, to preach your Psalm. Each of you have been assigned a Psalm, right, to preach. And each of you have been assigned a verse or some verses from Proverbs to preach. So what I'd like to do is, I'll give you a week to complete each assignment. So we'll do 4 or 5 weeks to finish each assignment for your psalm that you're preaching. And then what I'll do is we'll continue to have this time to meet together. So if any of you have questions on that assignment, or I can walk through the example that I gave you for that assignment, just that I want to help you be able to finish those assignments. And then by the end of that week, you'll need to have that assignment turned in so I can grade it, and then begin to work on the next assignment. So I'm going to give you 4 to 5 weeks to finish up your assignments on the Psalms, and then we'll spend a couple of weeks preaching the sermons for that you're on your psalm passage. Okay, and so I'm not sure yet the format, if we're going to do it by Zoom or if I'm going to have you record it. We need to come up, or maybe some of you, if you guys can't gather together yet, so we may have to do, we'll have to figure something out. But I want to like basically have you preach, all of you preach your psalm sermon within a couple weeks, and then we'll go to the Proverbs passage and do the same thing. We'll take 4 or 5 weeks. I'll continue to make myself available online at this time if you have questions on that assignment for your Proverbs passage, and then we'll work our way. I'm going to have you make sure you complete an assignment each week for your Proverbs passage so that then you can finish that, preach your sermon on Proverbs, and then we'll all be prepared for Module 4. So we're looking at like maybe a 3-month period of time where we'll work our way through the assignments, through the sermons for the first passage, through the assignments, through the sermons for the second passage, and then we'll see where we are at as far as Module 3. We're either we'll do some sort of format online if things have not opened up, or hopefully by that time I'll be able to travel. And then we'll just focus on prophecy together. So you'll be all done with your sermons, and we can just focus on how to study and preach prophetic texts. So that might be sometime in January or February by that point, where we can be ready for Module 4. So this is kind of what I'm thinking in my mind as far as trying to help us progress towards completing all the assignments for Module 3, completing the sermons, preaching those, and then being ready for Module 4. But sort of spreading things out, and then just having a time each week where I'll make myself available if you have questions. I'll highlight some things from each assignment, and then I'll bug you if you haven't turned yours in, because we've got to get those completed if you want to graduate from the program, get the certificate, and have covered everything. So again, this is not set for sure yet. I need to talk to Devraj about it, but this is kind of what I'm thinking going forward. Are there any questions or comments or suggestions that you guys have about next steps? Does that sound like something that will work, or what do you think?
Pastor Tim, you did upload the past videos of the class. I mean, this makeup class in one account in YouTube, right? So that we can go through them, and the notes also are sent via messengers.
Yes. Yeah, each session, I think I've recorded every session with you guys except the first one. I think I forgot the first one. But every session we've done is recorded. It's on the YouTube channel. It's not organized very well, but I did put, Taya Workshop Cebu session 2, session 3, session 4. So, and then I sent you a handout of what I covered in each of those sessions. So that's a resource for you guys. If you go back on Canvas, there's an example for each assignment that I've given there from another psalm, so that it gives a format and everything you need to complete it. So what I'll do is I'm going to highlight that. So let's say in 3 or 4 weeks we finish this workshop. First week I'm going to say, okay, guys, this week this assignment is due, and then I'll show you what the assignment is, walk through it, and then I'll ask any of you have any questions, and then I'll answer questions from your passage if you have a specific one. Say my passage, the background isn't very clear to me. I can't see where, why he wrote this psalm. So I'll spend a little time try to help you with that. All right. I want to help you complete this because I think, we give you these assignments because I want you to work through each step of the process so you can see how to do it. We think it's important that you go through each of the steps of the process. It'll help you be more effective. Any other questions or comments? Is that something that you think? Oh, Kent, did you have something?
No.
Okay. I'll after I talk to Devraj next week, I'll write out sort of the proposed plan. You can read it, and then I'd like to have your thoughts on it if you think that would work. And basically, what I'm saying is we'll continue to have this time to meet each week. It's just once we're done with this Psalm 99 workshop, what we're going to do then is just focus on the assignments that are due. We'll begin focusing on the Psalms passage for you and getting those assignments done, and then the Proverbs one. All right, and I'll give time each week. You know, whatever questions you have, I want to help answer them. And then, but then that assignment is, you know, has to be turned in by the end of that week so that we can make progress. So if you've already done it, then you're welcome to listen in, and or you know, you can take some time off because you're already finished. And I'll just make sure I've graded those assignments for you. All right. And then the tricky part's going to be figuring out how to do the preaching labs. I think that's the one challenge that I'm not sure the best way to do that. So if you have ideas there as well, that would be good. The internet is not stable for everybody. So I think if we do it live by Zoom, I think sometimes there may be issues with, like Pastor Sandy mentioned, you know, the guy's computer breaks down, and you know, that might happen if we try to do it live. So I don't know if recording it's the best way or not, but that may be what we have to do in the end.
Dr. Tim,
Yes.
on preaching lab, maybe the brush will come to Cebu.
Yeah, that's another option we're talking about. If things have opened up enough, you know, and you guys can gather together, there's some other options. I may not be able to come, but maybe Devraj. And of course, you know, Pastor AJ, Pastor TJ are there. They might conduct the labs if you can meet together. So we'll just have to see. That's probably going to be, you know, the first set of sermons will probably be around October. So hopefully by then we'll have a better idea. Hopefully the quarantine is lifted enough where you can gather, and then maybe I can come. We'll see. We just have to keep praying. All right. Any other questions? Cries of outrage or despair? Is everybody's nose bleeding?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, let me see. Let me ask Kent if you could close us in prayer, brother.